I have the opportunity to introduce one of my heroes. While there's many solutions we've talked about and more that we will talk about possible, there's been very few elected officials who bothered to talk about the gig economy and our workforce, and I always am very enamored of those who do, especially when they do it well, with good research and theoretical knowledge, political knowledge, and we're honored to have one of those speak with us today. We have a brief moment here with Senator Warner. Senator Warner was the first in his family to graduate from college. Mark Warner spent 20 years as a successful technology entrepreneur, a business leader in Virginia before he was elected governor in 2001. He left the governor's office in 2006, and at the time he left, Virginia was ranked as the best state for business, the best managed state, and the best state in which to receive a public education. Elected to the U.S. Senate in 2008, where he serves on the Senate Finance, Banking, Budget, and Rules Committee, as well as the Select Committee on Intelligence, which we don't get to question him about today. Recognized as a national leader in fighting for our military men and women, veterans, and working to design a bipartisan comprehensive plan. He's one of the people who has stepped forward to engage in bipartisan deal-making, bipartisan policy. Again, something I admire him for. He's a forward-thinking leader. As an early investor in the cellular telephone business, he co-founded the company that became Nextel and invested in hundreds of startup technology companies. And I think that background is one of the backgrounds that make him as knowledgeable and as friendly to the gig workers, to the independent contractors, and so on, a bulwark and a very large part of technology companies, the technology enterprise. I was pleased when he agreed to speak with us, and I'm honoring his very intense time pressure here, and so if we can bring him forward, I think everything will be great. Thank you again. Thank you very much for doing this, my friend.
Well, thank you, Carl. You know, there is an old Chinese saying that says, let us live in interesting times. I'm not sure I necessarily would have predicted this much interesting times all at once. It is an extraordinary time to be in Washington. It's an extraordinary time to be a policymaker. And it's an extraordinary time to be part of this this debate, this conversation. I want to point out two of my colleagues who are here, Connor McKay and Al Fitzpaine, who just joined this project. I've been trying to do this deep dive over now close to 2 years into the future of work and the ramifications of what that leads to. And candidly, what started as a interesting and kind of figuring out what's happening with these new companies that we're going to call gig platform companies has evolved into, I think, a much bigger, at least on my part, re-examination of what is really driving, in certain ways, modern capitalism. And I would argue that part of the challenge we face in America today with the anger on one side and the other, and the anger is very similar whether it comes from the left or the right, and I say this as Carl mentioned, I've had a longer experience in business than I have in politics, is that in many ways, modern capitalism, particularly modern capitalism that only focuses on the short term, is not working for enough people. And that is ending up reflecting itself in a breakdown of a lot of the traditional orders that kept people invested in the system. For a long time, for 75 plus years, most of the 20th century, you know, we lived in a world where even folks who might not do very well, my dad worked for the same company for 38 years, he never made very much money, but he had enormous amounts of predictability. He knew he had a job, and with that job came a certain set of benefits, certain set of a social contract that was established literally between government, labor, and business in ways that said, you work at the firm, at the shop, on the line, you can get certain things predictable. You're going to generally get an increase in your wages. You're going to have some level of retirement. You're going to have some ability to have some health care. And there's a series of programs that if stuff happens, and stuff always does happen, there will be a series of programs, normally government run, that will help you out. Unemployment, workman's comp, disability. About the mid-90s, a lot of this started to change. The beginnings of the change were really as corporations, and I claim myself to be a proud capitalist, but as the pressure on corporations got greater and greater for faster and faster returns, so that more and more work that was not core to the corporate function was outsourced, whether literally in terms of outsourced abroad or figuratively in the sense that no longer did the cafeteria worker or the janitor work for the firm that they might have been previously employed by for the last 30 years. Then build on top of that a transformation brought around by technology. I am, as Carl mentioned, my background was in telecom. I was the co-founder of Nextel, which means I am the only politician that says, even when I'm speaking, leave your cell phones on. They don't bother me at all. I also work in a place, also work in the only place in America where being a gang member is actually a good thing. I'm part of every gang there is in terms of bipartisanship. And this foray into this new platform-driven world that allowed people to monetize their time, their car, their apartment on an as-needed basis is really a revolution. It is, in many ways, part of the good part of that revolution was I don't think I fully appreciated as a policymaker how much people will give up to gain some level of flexibility and control back over their lives. And so the upside of this gig economy, this flexible economy, is a great deal more freedom. The downside is that with this freedom and with a mindset that we had set up in the 20th century that was frankly bifurcated into two legal categories. You were either a full-time employee or not. You were a W-2 or a 1099er. That kind of dual choice just wasn't going to work in a 21st century economy. It wasn't going to work because of the added freedom that has been brought about by these technology platforms. It was also not going to work because a lot of our kids, candidly, they didn't have the same dream and ambition of working for the same firm for 35 years with the goal being, that house in the suburbs, 2 cars, and maybe if they get really lucky, a little lake house. Brian Chesky at Airbnb spent a lot of time, I think in a much more articulate way than I, describing this sense that our millennials have about gaining experiences, living online, the willingness and desire to have a series of experiences throughout their life that would lead them to a career that frankly was going to be not 1 or 2 jobs, but more than likely a dozen plus jobs along the way. We also saw after the Great Recession the ability to either by choice or by financial necessity for more and more people to say, okay, the way I've got to realize my own personal dreams is I want to be that part-time worker as I work on my new firm, and I'm maybe also contracting a little bit out as an IT consultant. So instead of having 1 or 2 sources of revenue, you might have 3 or 4 more. And one of the things that Carl educated me on, and Kelly Services is a remarkable example of this, and I still use the story that you gave me on a repeated basis, is what is happening in terms of this transformation of this new contingent workforce is not just people who are drivers or are more kind of in a low skill category. Carl, I hope you've already cited this statistic that close to half of the NIH folks that work in every day, work in and walk in as Kelly Service affiliates. So we have in America today, while the gig worker is still the kind of hot, sexy thing that the press focuses on, what we have in America today, because of some of the transformation that started in the 90s, accelerated by these technology companies, increased by firms like Kelly Services, who have rethought in a much more progressive way what this social contract ought to look like. We have in America today, and Sarah has these numbers, a third of the American workforce in 2016 that is in some form of contingent work. Freelancer, independent contractor, part-time, gig, entrepreneur, you name it. And more than likely, that number of a third today will head towards 50% by 2030. That is a fundamental shift in the traditional economic environment, equation, and deal of anything that we've not only seen in our lifetime, but I would argue as remarkable as the transformation that went place from as we move from an agricultural economy to an industrial economy, as we now move into this kind of electronic bytes and bits driven economy. And what we've got to do, I believe, is rather than simply refight the battles of the 20th century around labor classifications, we need to meet the workforce of the 21st century where the workforce is at. And that is going to mean something that is going to take some new ideas and some new experimentation. And let me make some breaking news right now and say, chances are, if Washington in 2017 tries to legislate the rules of this new portable workforce economy, we are going to screw it up. I know that's going to be a shock to y'all because we have such a good track record the last couple of years on getting big programs all 100% right. But in many ways, the need for this new social contract is greater today than it really was even in the 20th century. Because the old associations, the old notion of an extended family, the old idea that, you know, your fellow union brothers and sisters were going to take care of you during the downturns really just doesn't exist. With this freedom and flexibility that offers a lot of upside for folks, also comes the fact that close to most of the folks who are in this 1/3 of the workforce who are operating on an extraordinary high wire have absolutely no safety net underneath them. So how do we do this in a time when uncertainty is high, when globalization is rushing forward, when we see technology offering changes that we are still just on the cusp of? I managed to do all right in business because the traditional telecom guys and Wall Street thought it would take 30 years to build out a cell phone network, and at the end of that 30 years, 5% of Americans would have cell phones. They were wrong and I got rich. So that some of the same predictions that say it will take 30 years for us, for example, to end up with driverless cars, I think are going to be equally wrong. And again, these numbers are a little squishy, but you know, it is very true that it's for males in America today, either the top or the second highest employment job is driving of one form or another. And chances are many of those jobs in a decade could be eliminated. Now, I'm not smart enough to think about or figure out how we deal with that or how we deal with the ongoing real challenges of full AI, full flush coming on in a whole host of other fields. But what I do believe is that we need right now to be doing things that are being, frankly, groundswell, bottoms up rather than top down in terms of experimenting on what this new social contract ought to look like. And Carl, I evangelize about this everywhere. On Monday, I spoke to close to 2,500 local elected officials at NACO, National Association of Counties. The amount of interest from mayors and county officials and governors, even if we don't have a lot of interest across the street on some of these topics, but the interest from local elected officials of saying, we want to be ground zero or experimental zone where we can try some of these new portable benefit ideas. You know, you could feel the interest was palatable. And we're starting to see some experimentation take place. We've seen the machinist and Uber start down the path of at least some form of a portable benefit. We've seen already in a long term, and for 30 plus years, a relatively successful disability program around the New York Black Car Fund. We've seen Handy try to work now within the New York State Legislature to say, at least how do we set up, without getting into the labor classification battle and fight, some set of benefits that might exist. I know Sarah had to leave, but Sarah Horowitz, who's also been one of my mentors and teachers in this space, has been working for long before it was cool on the idea of how do we create health and other kind of benefit programs for freelancers. We really got to get this right, because I would argue, again, one of the challenges that we face in our country right now is not only the enormous problem of economic inequality, but it is also equally important around economic insecurity. And if you have no benefits, if you have no safety net, if you have no social contract, then when the stuff hits the fan, as it always does at one point or another, there's nothing to catch you underneath. And what we're trying to do with this Future of Work initiative, and it is again morphed into something a little broader around kind of the whole basic components of capitalism, is how do we get this right in a 21st century way? So I'll leave you with two or three suggestions, and then would love, if time allows, to take 2 or 3 questions. First, we need much, much more experimentation around portable benefits. And I frankly think we ought to have a portable benefit system that would start when you turn 16 and you get that first job, and at least some component of, even from that first dollar you make, is attached to you and travels with you as you go from job to job. Now, who manages that dollar? Who manages that benefit? Those are all things we ought to experiment. We ought to experiment with 21st century unions that would aggregate groups together. We ought to experiment with, I've seen up in the upper Northwest, a series of actually faith-based organizations that provide these type of benefit services. I think there's enormous opportunity within the fintech world. Can we manage these benefits on the same device that our kids use, that hand-powered computer that used to be called a cell phone, in a whole host of ways? The UK in this area, I just came back from sitting with Mark Carney, the head of the Bank of England, is really way far ahead of us in terms of trying to create a regulatory sandbox that would say, can fintech be a tool to create and try out portable benefits? So we need to think about different models. We need to think about, and I believe, maybe even thinking about different whole approach to programs. Is the concept of unemployment insurance really valid in a 21st century workforce where the worker determines when he or she chooses to work? But the idea of having some emergency fund, one of the papers we put together had a very creative idea that said, let's build up, in effect, a benefit reserve that would equal about $2,600. The government would be insurer of last resort if you had catastrophic activities, and that would be a fund that you could draw down upon when you had that $400 bill that was unexpected, that the Fed shows that 47% of Americans would have to go into bankruptcy because they couldn't afford an unexpected $400 bill. And then as you drew down that money, you would rebuild it, and funds that went above that would go into some level of a retirement account that you really couldn't get at in the too often easy ways we get at 401k accounts. How do we rethink these? With Obamacare or Trump Care, if we want to call it that this week, or whatever the repealing and replacement methodology ought to be, we should not lose the flexibility. There would not be, in many ways, a gig economy if you had not started at least decoupling health care and employment that Obamacare allowed. So whether you like it or hate it, how do we make sure that we maintain, in whatever is a replacement, some flexibility? How do we also, and I will close with, so much for my time, close with these couple comments. We've got to get not only benefits right in this new social contract for the gig workforce, but I would argue 3 other things. Second, we have to rethink training and upskilling. And there is literally no economic reason in a world where people are going to have 20 different jobs during their career for any business to invest in upskilling somebody who's a low and moderate income employee, because that employee is most likely the most vulnerable to globalization, technology, or automation elimination. And even as a former governor and senator, I got to tell you, most government training programs, frankly, don't work that well. So how can we incent businesses to really spend meaningful resources on dollars, on meaningful training delivered through third parties, so training doesn't simply become a trip to Las Vegas, for employees below and I got nothing against Vegas, for example, employees that make below $70,000. How do we think that in a different way? And let me make at least a case that we may have an opportunity to do this in a very bold fashion when we come to the repatriation debate around tax reform, because I think if we get anything done in tax reform, we will get repatriation done. $2.5 trillion brought back. So far, the bid and the ask has been, how low can the rate be? And the Democrats want to make sure we use some of the one-time taxes for infrastructure. I think that's a fair debate, but why not also say part of the price of bringing that dollars back, those of you who want to make America great again, well, every company that brings those dollars back ought to have a meaningful training program in place for everyone that makes less than $70,000. How do we have a fulsome debate in our country? And this one, depending on whether you're an operator or on the finance side, is and I am not 100% convinced that I've by any means got the right answer here, but we ought to have a real debate in this country about long-termism versus short-termism. The average hold on a public stock in America has gone from 8 years to 4 months. 25 years ago, 50% of corporate profits were reinvested back in the businesses. Today, 95% of corporate profits are spent on share buybacks and dividends. If you look at the companies, well, people will say, well, Mark, what about Amazon? And, they've not made any profits, but they got a gazillion-dollar valuation. The companies that are able to withstand the pressure of short-term particular activists, I'm not here for a long time, I'm here for the next 2 quarters, are usually companies that have differential classes of stock for the founders. Now, I don't think that ought to be a long-term solution set, but we ought to have a robust debate in this country whether this question of the movement of ownership of companies, which has moved from many ways from being owners to renters, is actually a good thing. Because if you're only a renter, the first thing you're willing to give up on is benefits for your employee, long-term commitment to your employee, training to your employee. And then finally, and this would be one where I don't think it ought to be driven by government, why can't we take all of the groups who are working on these issues, and there are a host of groups in the nonprofit sector, from Mike Bloomberg's SASB effort to the benefit corporation movement to inclusive capitalism and conscientious capitalism, host of groups. Why can't we challenge the foundation world to say, let's put out a giant X Prize and have all these groups, without the government, come together and set the equivalent of kind of a LEED certification, a gold, silver, and bronze, on how companies treat their workers. And let the market dictate. Awful lot of private equity firms that I'm aware of and pension funds that want to invest in the right in the right kind of companies that treat their workers well, whether they are short-term workers or long-term workers, but we have no independent metric. And what gives me so much hope, even in a town that isn't normally called hopeful, is really our kids, because I know my kids and your kids, the millennials, even if they're not classically political, they want to work for and buy from companies that bear some level of social responsibility. So this whole swath of issues that starts with the transformation of the work experience moving from a single long-term employment to a more gig, transformational, flexible, that has to include portable benefits, but I would also agree, I would also argue, has to be part of a broader discussion that says we can make capitalism in the 21st century actually work for the vast majority of Americans. And boy, oh boy, wouldn't that debate be a lot more interesting and a lot more valuable than what passes for debate across the street today. Good news about all this, again, is I don't have the foggiest idea whether all of these ideas fall as Democrat or Republican, or liberal or conservative. What they do fall into categories is whether we embrace the future or simply look backwards. And America has always been at its best when we've been about the future and not about the past. And in some small way, I hope to be part of this debate, working along with folks like Carl and all of you to make sure we get this right. Thank you all very much.